This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Scumbag Loser and Sweetness and Lightning. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys with advanced degrees and future advanced degrees talking about manga. And on this month's episode, Shea and I are going to discuss Scumbag Loser by Mikoto Yamaguti. And then after that, we're going to talk about the first 5 volumes of Guido Amakakuri's Sweetness and Lightning. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off at the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts will be 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off of the cover. But many times, you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
This month, you can get volumes of Bakuman for 30% off, and you can also get books like Drunken Dream and Other Stories by Moto Hagio for 30% off as well.
That's right. Every single month is discount month at Discount Comic Book Service. And you know why? Because discount is in their name. Definitely head over to dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics and manga pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. Shea, we have a couple of interesting titles to discuss this month, but before we get to that, there are a couple of things we should probably share with our listeners. And the first one is some listener email.
Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
We have been getting not just one or two emails from this listener, but a variety over the past month. And this is someone who has corresponded with us in the past. This is Jason Roulaine. And beginning back in April, he began sending us a few emails asking us a few questions here or there. So, for instance, he said, are you guys planning on reviewing the upcoming release of Appleseed Alpha? But a lot of his emails are also news-related. So he will hear that a particular publisher may be putting out something in the future, and he'll alert us to that. Telling us things about, let's say, Captain Harlock, Battle Angel, Alita. He's also mentioned something about Queen Emeraldus, which you and I have discussed on the show in the past. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to thank Jason for sending all of those emails. Now, I haven't responded to all of them, and, some of them, Shea, I know that I forwarded on to you because I don't think you were included in the original. But I think he just wants to keep in touch and update us on various things, and we appreciate that. So, Jason, keep it up.
Yeah, we, like you said, we definitely appreciate it. And I know personally, when people let me know about certain books that are coming out, that I might not be aware of, I really, really appreciate that as well, because, it's hard to keep up with all the releases. So if something goes over my head, emails like that from listeners are really, really appreciated.
That's right. And so not only Jason, but the rest of you who listen to our monthly manga show, definitely get in touch and let us know what's on your mind, what you think about our reviews, and also fill us in on titles you think that we may be interested in discussing on this series. Mm-hmm. Now, the other bit of news we can share with our listeners is the recent, I guess last month or earlier this month, announcement of the 2017 Eisner Award nominations. And in particular, Shea, I want to draw our listeners' attention to the Best U.S. Edition of International Material Asia category, because of those 6 nominees, you and I on the manga series have discussed 4 of them. Goodnight Pun Pun is up for nomination. Same with Princess Jellyfish, Wandering Island, and the Osamu Tezuka story. All of those we have discussed on the manga series. The one manga in translation that we did not discuss that's being nominated is Orange, the Complete Collection by Ichigo Takano. But you and I had discussed reviewing the Orange series. We just never got around to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, the sixth nominee is The Art of Charlie Chan Hak Chai by Sunny Liu. And although we haven't discussed this on the manga series, we have discussed that book quite a number of times on the Comics Alternative regular review shows. And we even had Sunny Liu on about a year ago for an interview to talk about that book. A couple of things about this year's nominees. One, I find it interesting that Sunny Liu's book is nominated under the Best U.S. Edition of International Material Asia. I mean, it has other nominations this year as well, which it richly deserves. But it was my assumption that for the categories Best U.S. Edition for International Material and then U.S. Edition of International Material Asia, that those were going to be works in translation. But maybe that was a false assumption on my part, because if The Art of Charlie Chan Hak Chai is up, that wasn't translated. It was published in Singapore before the United States, of course, but it was in English.
Yeah, that was a book that I was going to ask you about, because I understand the category to be open to all Asian works. There's, I think Drawn and Quarterly has a Korean comic coming out, if it's not already out. I think it might have come out this month. Uncomfortably Happily, I think is the name of it, that we've talked about talking on the show before. But like you, I thought I actually didn't know that it had been originally published in Singapore. I thought it was originally published in the United States, so I had questions about that as well. But it may be open in the category because it was originally published in Singapore, regardless of its original language. But I was curious about that as well, because it definitely stands out amongst those the other 5 books, which are all manga.
Right.
So I would be curious to hear from maybe a judge or a festival administrator who could answer a question like that, because I honestly don't know.
Yeah, now that I think about it, I think I will email Jackie Estrada, who oversees the Eisner Awards every year, and she could fill me in on the criteria for this category, because I did have some questions about a couple of other categories, the best digital and the best webcomic categories, which is something that Sean and I will discuss next month on our June webcomic show. So maybe she can fill me in on the best international material Asia criteria as well. But the other thing I think that's much more important about this year's list of nominations is that the vast majority of them under this category, you and I have discussed on the manga show. Yeah. So, and again, with Orange, we had thought about it, but we never got around to it because we didn't have the time. But it just goes to show you that we talk about important things on the Comics Alternative, both the regular show and our monthly series. And it's what Andy Kunka and I have called the Comics Alternative bump. We talk about it on our podcast. It becomes important as a result.
Yeah, I mean, I think that demonstrates to our listeners that we've got good taste. We're tastemakers. The books we talk about are the good books of the year. So yeah, they should keep listening. We're not just talking about the trash of the day.
Well, let's get to this month's books, neither of which I would call trash of the day. And we're going to begin with Scumbag Loser. This is written and drawn by Mikoto Yamaguti. It is coming out from Yen Press. In fact, this is the very first time we've discussed a Yen Press book on our monthly manga series. And this has been out for a while. This was released as a large, I guess you can call it omnibus collection, in November of 2016. But it wasn't until relatively recently that you and I were able to get review copies of this. And I was really interested in seeing what it was about because I think if nothing else, I was intrigued by the title.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a striking image, certainly, especially when you get the book. The first thing I noticed was this really lovely production design and production quality that has like a kind of foil on the white negative space next to that like striking yellow and black. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely a book you see and you get curious about and you get interested in. So, but like you, I really didn't know anything more about the book beyond that curious image.
Yes. Now, I think I had originally seen Scumbag Loser in a bookstore. I was just walking around in I think Books A Million one day, and I came across in their manga section Scumbag Loser, and it looked interesting, but I couldn't open it up and look through it because it was shrink wrapped. And mm-hmm. you will see on the cover of the book there is a parental advisory warning, explicit content label, and so that's why they shrink wrap it. But it did look interesting. I was reading the blurb on the back, and so I thought, maybe it's something we can check out. Now, Scumbag Loser was originally published in 3 parts, and I'm assuming that in the U.S. or for English speakers, this was published in 3 parts, but then back in November of last year, collected into one larger volume. And it is a large volume. This is mm-hmm. a hefty book. It is, God, is it over? Yeah, it's not quite 600 pages.
Yeah, it's a pretty good size. I certainly wasn't expecting it to be quite as large as it ended up being. That definitely took me by surprise.
Right. Now, this may be a challenge, but if we were going to introduce the premise of Scumbag Loser to listeners who are unfamiliar with it, how would we do this?
That's tough because I think the way it's described is, like I'm looking at, because very little about it is if it's available in English. So I'm looking at the Amazon page for it actually. Mm-hmm. And the first line is, high schooler Masahiko Mirai has exactly one thing going for him, a keen sense of smell. And that kind of makes it seem as though the book will revolve around that. And that is an important plot point of the book. But all the descriptions like that I've seen of it, they really lend that aspect of the book a lot of importance. And they don't really touch on the actual kind of plot even a little. So it is a difficult kind of book to summarize, but I would say it's about a loser who invents a fake girlfriend and then she ends up being real, but it's a horror comic, and so mm-hmm. things go really wrong. But there's all these like weird complications and twists and kind of like details that make it a little more complicated than that. But yeah, I think that's a pretty good gist of the main thrust of the book.
Yeah, and it's interesting in that you mentioned that this is a horror title, and it is. I didn't think that this would be as much of a horror story as it turned out to be. Last year for our Halloween show, we looked at a variety of horror mm-hmm. manga, and I hope we can do the same this year.
Yeah.
But this is one of those titles that would definitely fit into that kind of Halloween episode that we mm-hmm. Have done and plan on doing for this year, because there is this horrific element to it where things begin mm-hmm. turning really strange and going into unlikely territory. Because you're right, the way that they describe the book on the back, the blurb on Amazon, and all of the other places where you will see this advertised, like Yen Press's website, is they emphasize the protagonist, Masahiko's ability to smell. He's got a very keen sense of smell. And in fact, when you look on the cover of the book, it is really intriguing. You see this image of a boy, which we find out is Masahiko, and he's holding a cell phone up. So he's looking at something. He's sweating. In his other hand, he has a pair of girls' panties, not too close to his nose, but close enough to where he may be able to sniff it. But also there is a word balloon, and in the word balloon coming from him, it says, "Lick Yamada-kun's foot." So the smell of the foot, the smell of the panties, there's something kind of weird and perverted going on, while he's looking at whatever it is that's on his phone. Plus the title, Scumbag Loser, is blazoned over his eyes. And so it's like they're blanking out his eyes for purposes of anonymity. So it is a rather provocative cover. Mm-hmm. And you're right that much of the premise, I think, springs from his unique ability to smell and what that allows him to do in terms of figuring out the reality surrounding him. Mm-hmm. But I guess the bedrock of the premise would be the more horrific side of this, mm-hmm. which slowly comes to the fore as you get into, let's say, the first third or the first quarter of this book. And that is that there is some kind of creature, and it's never explained. It's never given a mm-hmm. name. I don't know if you want to call it a thing, a monster, an it, or what.
I think, that's the only reference we get to its kind of identity is it's like a flashback sequence, and I think even it is in quotation marks. Mm-hmm. I don't have the book in front of me at the moment, but
it's not a clown. It's not Pennywise.
No, it's like a very strange creature that it has all of these kind of complex motivations, and it's behind all these very complex machinations. But it's kind of where it comes from is in some ways made very clear, and in other ways left very mysterious. It's for listeners who are familiar with the show Samurai Jack. There's like a 3-part episode that has the origin of the show's villain Aku, and he kind of begins life spontaneously as this kind of like black figuration of like malevolence. And his existence before this, like he was like, he didn't exist, and then all of a sudden he existed. Mm-hmm. And there's a kind of a similar origin story, shall we say, for this the monster at the heart of this story as well.
Yeah, because we don't know exactly where this creature, this monster, this entity sprang from. So it's a mystery. But what basically happens is that throughout the story, and we learn more and more, and this is not a spoiler, I don't think, by any means, mm-hmm. Is this force, this creature, this entity, slowly begins consuming people in this community, in Masahiko's school. And in consuming them, they become them. So they inhabit their bodies, and in many ways they improve these individuals in various ways. So for instance, if someone is very slovenly dressed and doesn't bathe, as is the case with, the character Yamada, once this creature consumes this person, then they become a little better, a little more admirable, someone that his or her parents would be proud to call their son or daughter. And one by one, the people, and not just the kids in this school and then community, are being consumed. And Masahiko is he's one figure who, I say figure this out as much as he can figure something out. He knows something's amiss. He knows that there's this mysterious creature or entity or force consuming people and changing things and trying to take over the world, so to speak. So that's basically what we have going on here. What first began as a strange story about a high school kid with unique smelling abilities turns into a rather weird and surreal horror story.
Yeah, it's a weird kind of book because I definitely, it definitely took me by surprise that turn about, I don't know, maybe in the second chapter, about 50 pages in, there's a kind of abrupt turn where it becomes very obvious what the book is, and it is not at all what I expected, and that is kind of it was kind of shocking in a way because I was totally taken by surprise by that shift in not tone so much, because I would say it's pretty tonally consistent from the first page, but generically there's a kind of shift, the kinds of things you see, the kinds of scenarios you start to see, and how they start to play out in the last 500 pages is distinctly different from this first 50 pages, which is mostly about Masahiko kind of making fun of his classmates and sniffing panties and sitting alone in a room and laughing at the world and how everyone's disgusting and gross, and then you get to the scene where it's like very obvious that like that is not at all what the book is about, and it's a weird one. It's a strange book.
Yes, it definitely strange. Especially as you mentioned, the last 50 pages. I mean, things get really wild in the very last part of this book, and it's even hard to understand exactly what's going on. Before you and I turned on the mic today to record this episode, we were discussing with each other what we thought may have been happening at the end, because it's really unclear, and I think it's intentionally ambiguous. I kind of like that. It is confusing, but I'm okay with a little bit of confusion with the kind of story this is. Yeah, I mean, I think there's the end of the story, and then you get a note from Yamaguti where he talks about the like ambiguous ending, and some people will get it, and like if you'll get it instantly, and some people may not get it, and that he likes that. But immediately after that, and I don't know if this was originally published as part of the series or what this is, because it's included in this book as some sort of like epilogue that may not have been featured in its original serialization or something like that, where they make explicit, there's a kind of I hate to say ambiguous, because I think it's fairly clear what the last line of the book is referring to, but if it is ambiguous for you as a reader, that epilogue really, really, really makes it explicit. And so I did think that was very strange to include that that kind of explicating ending on these sequences that are in some ways ambiguous, because I think they're supposed to be in others, because I think certain threads just don't get kind of wrapped up. Yeah.
But that ending is really struck me as very odd to include, because like you said, it is that last 50 or so pages it's not super cut and dry, but then that added ending kind of makes it more simple. So what was your kind of take on that? The last 2 or 3 pages that I'm talking about after that note? Right.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that it makes less ambiguous, or it makes more clear the last couple of pages of the story proper. As to why Yamaguti decided to include it, I don't know. Maybe if it wasn't in the original 3rd volume of Scumbag Loser, when it was originally published in 3 parts, I mean, maybe he got enough of a reaction from readers that, it would be nice if there were a little less ambiguity. And so he did that to, I guess, satisfy a certain type of readership, which, I guess I'm okay with. I don't feel that was necessarily a bad thing that he included this, if we want to call it epilogue, in this edition.
Yeah, I mean, I think my explanation made it sound like I have much stronger opinions about it than I do. So I'm actually closer to you. It's interesting to include, and it's kind of curious, but I'm not up in arms over it. I don't feel like it ruined this book or anything like that.
Yeah. Now, a moment ago, you mentioned something about the character of Masahiko, and, he is our protagonist here. He is throughout the entire narrative. And you described him as someone who is a loser, as a loner, someone who just sits in his room, kind of a stalker type figure, right? Because when we first see him in his room, we see that one of his walls is completely consumed with these images of a young girl. And we don't know at first who this is, but we figure out after a while that this is Haruka Musazawa, and Haruka is this young girl that he mentions at the very beginning is his girlfriend, right? So what happens in the early pages of this story is that Masahiko is bullied by, for, I guess, lack of a better word, the jocks in his class, the popular kids, right? The ones who aren't the losers. And so what they do to him is, what they do to a lot of people, they berate him, they push him down, they physically abuse him, they step on him. And so what Masahiko tells them at one point, because he thinks that it will raise him a little bit in their eyes, is he says, I'm not a loser. I've got a girlfriend, and a loser wouldn't have a girlfriend. And then they ask him, well, who is this girlfriend? And he goes, Haruka Musazawa. And he comes up with that name, and at first it seems to come from out of nowhere, but then he explains to us, the reader, in a little exposition, that this is someone that he used to know when he was a lot younger. It was a schoolmate. And she died. Now, we don't know at this point how she died or why she died. We find that out as the story continues. But for now, at the beginning, the only thing we know is this is someone that he knew that is dead. And so he thinks that he's covered his tracks. And then what happens soon after this incident? They get a new classmate. The classmate is Haruka Musazawa. And so everybody is, oh, well, this is the girlfriend you were talking about. And Masahiko is amazed. It's like, oh, my God, where'd she come from? And it actually is the Haruka that he remembers, albeit older, from his childhood. And so they go walking. They go to something like, a soda shop to get something to drink, to get some ice cream. And that's when Masahiko confronts Haruka with reality. He says, I know what happened to Haruka, the real Haruka, so you cannot be Haruka. And that's when Haruka reveals her secret in kind of an ambiguous way at this point, but she suggests that she may not be human. And so this is what sets up the mystery of these creatures, these entities, the it figure, and what they're doing with the humans in this community.
Yeah, I did want to. I'm glad you brought up that first kind of sequence where Masahiko is really depicted as this very kind of grotesque almost character. And, for me, the book was kind of difficult to swallow for the very simple fact that it's almost like a rehabilitation of this kind of like gross, perverse stalker. I mean, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that in that scene you were just talking about where he kind of confronts Haruka, he mentions that the Haruka character she can't possibly look the way she does because the picture he showed the class of Haruka was of her from 5 years ago that he had digitally altered. And so he spends all this time sitting in a dark room full of these like all digitally altered pictures of this child that he made to like, I mean, I think the implication is that he's getting off to it. He's masturbating to it. We don't see any of that explicitly, but he's a truly despicable and disgusting character. I think a morally repugnant character. And so for me, the rest of the book after that is this story where he becomes like a hero. And then there's some other complications much closer to the end that I think might be a spoiler, and so I don't want to give those away, where you learn more about the Haruka character that seem to kind of reward him for his behavior, or in some well, I don't want to say justify his behavior, but it does come as a kind of reward for his behavior, and really there's just nothing wrong with the way he's been conducting his life, and he just needed to be loved, and for me it's just difficult to kind of get through when you have a character who is rendered as he's a caricature of this kind of person. I mean, he really is like on TV when characters quote unquote look like pedophiles. This is what they're talking about. It's like a joke about this kind of person. And this story is really this kind of like transformation of him into a like a hero. And for me, that was really a strange and difficult arc to get through. I mean, did you have a take on that kind of transition from his character, or?
Yeah, and my take is different from yours. I wouldn't necessarily call him a hero, and I know you don't mean hero in, let's say, an ideal sense. I think that he becomes, maybe an anti-hero would be a better way of putting it, but even then, I don't think that some of that moral repugnance is completely washed away even by the end. And I do think that Yamaguti does still maintain the Masahiko character as problematic, even at the very end. But what I think explains his growth, it's not so much his growth as a moral figure, right? I do think he learned certain lessons along the way, but I think his growth is more in the mind of the reader. In other words, we get to see him as much more of a three-dimensional character and not just a two-dimensional pervert, let's say, that there is a reason why he is the way that he is, and it has everything to do with the way he was brought up, with his family, specifically his father. And again, we don't want to give too much information away because then we'll be approaching spoiler territory. But I think once you understand what Masahiko had to do in terms of growing up as a young kid and how that turned him into the person he's become now, you start to dislike him a little less. And so I think that his growth is more in the eyes of the reader than as a character who learns his lesson, right? Who learns, oh, I shouldn't look down on people. Because I don't know if he really changes that much. From the very beginning, we learned that, and this is nothing new. Anyone who, has an experience with junior high, middle school, or high school knows this, is that, there's a hierarchy among populations in school, right? And if you don't want to seem like a complete loser, you want to be a little better than the person on the lowest rung. So with Masahiko, he is a complete loser to his classmates, but at first he can say, at least I'm not as bad as a friend of his or one of his fellow classmates, a boy by the name of Yamada, because Yamada is much, much worse than Masahiko. But then Yamada becomes the first, I guess, once the story begins, victim of this weird monster entity, creature thing, whatever it is. And Yamada turns from someone who's completely repulsive, even more so than Masahiko, into someone who is, not that bad. He actually gets a girlfriend, someone by the name of Maya, who becomes extremely important toward the end of this book. So I do think that one of the things that Yamaguti does is he establishes this repulsiveness, right? And this hierarchy of popularity and loserdom at the very beginning. And it's not very attractive. But yet as the story develops, then we start to understand the context surrounding how, let's say, Masahiko became the way that he did, how he sees the world. And I do think that toward the end of this book, the moral lesson becomes much more prominent. And it's not just necessarily linked to Masahiko and his classmates, the kids, in other words. I mean, they're part of it, but I think it's the larger community, their parents especially. And so this becomes a book all about not judging people and not wanting perfection. And thematically, and I don't think this is a spoiler, but thematically, what I found at the very end is that parents who want their children to become the ideal child, the perfect son or the perfect daughter, to be polite, to be popular, to get the good grades, are really being unrealistic. And it's this unrealistic expectations that parents and maybe larger society as a whole puts on young people that ends up creating monsters. And so I think that's where the moral lesson is in this book, Scumbag Loser.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of what you said, I agree on. And one thing I did want to touch on is, you mentioned that Yamaguti kind of develops Masahiko's character as the book goes along, and he becomes a much more three-dimensional character, a much more richly textured character. And I think that's a pretty fair and accurate description of Yamaguti's writing of Masahiko in this book. I think for me, a big hurdle that Yamaguti establishes for himself is to it's Masahiko is from the very beginning painted as this very broad, very flat, very two-dimensional, very cartoonish character. Right. And it's really not until like 60 pages in that we start to see, another side of him, more depth to him. And maybe for if he was a side character and the first time we see him, he's kind of flat or two-dimensional, it might be different, but he is the central character from the very first page. And he's flat to like a comical degree almost for so long that it does become it creates a strange dynamic between his character and the reader and his arc and the reader. And I do think that his character does, the reader is meant to empathize with him or sympathize with him more and more as the book goes along. And I think that's evident from not just the story Yamaguti tells, but the way he tells that story, from the shots he chooses, where it's clearly, I've talked about this book quite a bit on the show, and it's really informed the way I understand like storytelling and the representation of like gender and stuff like horror. This book called Men, Women, and Chainsaw, written by Carol Clover, and in that book she talks about the way that certain shots are meant to, they imply that we are a character looking at something, and they are meant to kind of put us in their shoes and get us to sympathize with that character. And I think there's a lot of that going on in Scumbag Loser, where the things that Yamaguti is drawing, they're clearly from the perspective of Masahiko, and we are meant to kind of like see through his eyes and sympathize with him. But for me, sympathizing with a character like that is problematic, because I think far too often in not just Western culture, but I think global culture, we are supposed to forgive or accept or sympathize with or tolerate men in particular who exhibit the kind of grossest behavior possible. Thinking about or I wasn't thinking about it when I was reading it, but talking about it with you, I'm really thinking of the Noah Van Sciver's Fan of Bukowski 2, which I just wrote about for the AV Club. And one of the big problems I had with that book is that it is a book that, if you've read the first Fan of Bukowski, Fan of Bukowski is like a shitty, gross, disgusting. He's a jerk. He's not a good writer, but he thinks he is. He's pompous. He's arrogant. And that's really funny. But at the end of Fan of Bukowski 2, you get like 200 pages of him, this character, like he's clearly like a satirical, parodical character. But at the end, he still, for some reason, and Noah Van Sciver even puts words like, well, I don't know why I'm so attracted to him. I don't know why I'm so charmed by him, in the mind of the most prominent female character. And she ends the book still kind of being charmed by him and enchanted by him. And he's a mess, but she really wishes she could still be in a relationship with him, even though at the end of the first book, he left her without any explanation to go, across the country. And I really am just tired of these narratives where the whole book, the man is the asshole, and then at the end, he still gets the girl for some inexplicable reason, still loves him or is enchanted by him or is attracted by him. And so this idea that we are supposed to feel sympathy for a character like this is just something that it's so kind of cliche and boring, and the kind of political implications of that are just kind of gross. And I don't really have much interest in seeing that anymore. So I think your description of Yamaguti's kind of rendering of that character is accurate. I just my kind of reaction to that is I think a lot different than yours. But this was a book I just really I kind of had to shake my head at. It was it was one of those. But I think it's clear that you felt slightly differently, at least.
Well, yes and no, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. I felt differently in that I do feel that even though the character of Masahiko doesn't come across at the very end as a redeemed figure or someone who has learned his lesson, he's not going to be the same way. I do think that because of the context surrounding him and his upbringing, we can understand why he is the way that he is. And so that tempers our initial repulsiveness, right? When we see this kind of character. So I do think that I don't want to say I sympathize with him, but I can understand him more. Okay. So there is more of an empathic connection, I guess. Not that I want him to be redeemed, but I can understand why he is the way that he is. And so he doesn't seem as distant to me as a character as I guess he does to you. But I also say I do agree with you to some degree because, and not necessarily through the way in which Masahiko is represented as a figure, but through the book as a whole, what Yamaguti does, especially toward the end, and especially as it relates to women. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you noticed this, and I'm sure you did. But as we got into the last half of this story, especially the last third, it seemed to me that the female characters were being drawn in a broader, more sexually objectifying way. And it comes down primarily to the size of the breasts. Mm-hmm. At the very beginning of this book, it didn't seem over the top or outlandish or too unrealistic. But then in the last third of this book, there were just certain characters that we got to see more of, not necessarily in terms of skin, but we got to see they had more page and panel space. And when they were female characters, usually their breasts were of this enormous size. In other words, they were becoming objects of desire. This is especially the case with a character who's mentioned at the beginning, but then we don't see her until around the end. And this is a woman who, quote unquote, becomes Yamada's girlfriend, Maya. And Maya, we learn toward the end of the book, is someone who was probably turned by Haruka, the monster Haruka, but then is in competition with Haruka to be the monster entity in control of things. And the way she's drawn, the size of her breast are just over the top. I mean, when you have one breast larger than the character's head, that's a problem. But there are also other characters, as in the last part of this story, that was the case as well. There's one figure that we're not introduced to until I think after halfway through, and this is Yumi Ookura, and she is this very shy, very nerdy, very reserved fangirl kind of figure, right? And she's someone who idolizes popular characters, especially female singers. And when we first see her, she is reserved in the sense that she is tightly wrapped, right? She wears a coat zipped all the way up. And she kind of hides herself, definitely hides her body. But then in the latter part of this book, we get to see her a little more revealed, even physically revealed. And I'll be damned if she didn't have this unrealistic bust. And I mean, it's almost like I'm reading Gilbert Hernandez Luba stories, right? But but Gilbert Hernandez is doing what he's doing for a particular reason that's very different from the reasons, whatever they may be, that Yamaguti is representing these female figures toward the last part of Scumbag Loser. But so getting back to my point, I definitely see your point in terms of the potential misogynistic male gaze attitude, especially in the way that Yamaguti draws the women in this story, which becomes something a little more harder to swallow as the novel progresses.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Gilbert Hernandez because I was going to say, I'm less concerned that like he's drawing these like busty women than kind of how he frames those bodies, how he poses those bodies, how those bodies interact with other bodies. And yeah, I think in this story they are definitely all of the women are kind of like these they're like these anatomical parts pushed so far past the kind of like fantastical ideal that they become almost grotesque, right? Like they're like oh, big breasts are great, but like these breasts are so big that they're like scary. And there's a lot of that, and it's
part of the horror of this book. Yeah,
I hesitate to say that like there's a. I mean, I definitely think that the way he kind of renders women's bodies is problematic, and this dynamic between a character like Maya, who not only has very large breasts but is scantily clad, and this villain, and Yumi character, who, like you said, is I think she's the only human woman character that we spend any time with whatsoever, and she is completely covered up. She is covered head to toe, and you barely even see her face. Her jacket is pulled so far up her face. But the other, like, they're women's bodies, but they're not human characters. They are rendered as very kind of voluptuous and curvy and big breasted, and they are wearing almost no clothing whatsoever. And so you create this interesting dynamic between like a real woman and a fake woman. You create this like binary between like a real and fake woman, and like, how they exist in the world. But while all that's true, I'm kind of hesitant to use the word misogynist. I think there's definitely like a patriarchal component to this, because it ultimately, running throughout this book, is a privileging of like the lives of men over the lives of women. Because like I said, you really don't get to spend any time with any characters who are actually human, who are women. I mean, Yumi, you get a little bit of that, but it's mostly Masahiko. And then towards the end of the book, you get this detective character who you spend some time with, and he's got like a rich backstory. And, and
Yumi, I wanted to know more about him.
Yeah, you get a lot of how he relates to the other characters and his history of the police force and all this stuff. Yumi, you do get to spend some time with, and you get a pretty solid understanding of her personality and who she is and how she interacts with other people, but you don't really know anything about her life. She is this character who kind of comes into the story, and she it's almost as though she never existed before then. Right. So you definitely have this patriarchal kind of privileging of men's lives over women's, which is a very problematic element of the book that I think is kind of made obvious by this, like you said, the way he draws these women as almost comical.
Right. Because, Yumi is seen as very submissive and subservient, not necessarily to men, but to the idol, right, with a capital I. And the idol in this case is Haruka, who joins this, and this is where the story gets really, really surreal, joins this group, this super teen group called STH24. And in the notes in the back of the book, Yamaguti describes or explains, I guess, the satirical side to this name of the group. But it seems that Yumi comes across as kind of a pathetic figure, whereas if we saw more of her life, I think maybe as a female counterpoint to the Masahiko character, then there would have been more, I don't know if you want to call it balance, in this narrative. But we also potentially got that toward the beginning of this graphic novel, this work of manga, with Chiyaha. And Chiyaha, I think that's her name, is someone who is very much like Masahiko, and who is unpopular, who is abused by the more popular girls in class, and who also has this very unusual and unique ability at smell. And this becomes a kindred spirit she becomes a kindred spirit with Masahiko, but yet she's quote unquote killed off or consumed by this monster creature fairly quickly. And I was just hoping to find more out about this character as a female counterpart to Masahiko, but Yamaguti doesn't allow that. And so I think with his truncated representations of Chiyaha and Yumi, we never do, as you point out, get to see anything other than a dramatically male perspective of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and both of those characters, I think, and even more of Haruka or Maya, I would have liked to have seen more. But Yamaguti has all of these opportunities to really explore the kind of and texture the lives of these women, and he just never does. And I feel like I'm putting a lot on him, but I think, and it's a problem principally because it is something you see so often. It's not that Yamaguti, this work is, particularly horrendous and we should, ban this from schools. But I think it's worth talking about because here's an example of something you see all the time. And it's really the commonality of what Yamaguti does here. His failure to explore those things is something that you see all the time, and that's really why it's a problem.
Yeah. But, even as problematic as these issues are that you and I are raising, I do think that the book's larger message, its bigger theme, I don't know if I want to say redeems it completely, but it does give the narrative some nobility, and this gets back to what I said earlier, that at least the way I read this, one of the biggest messages that I took away from Scumbag Loser is that it's the way that parents treat their children and what they expect from their kids, and by association, what larger society expects from younger people, that causes them in this particular story to turn out the way that they do. And so the fault is not on the kids and the various machinations and relationships that they have, but it's on the adult world. And it's a kind of condemnation of that, parental societal expectations of some normalcy, right? What we consider normal and how people should live.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that kind of assessment of the book's themes, and it's definitely a book that's not without merit. I'm glad I got the opportunity to read it. I'm sure a lot of people would enjoy it. Just a reminder to our listeners to read things with a critical eye, and sometimes you enjoy a book and it's not perfect. It's got some flaws. So.
Well, Shea, let's take this opportunity to turn to the second title that we're looking at this month, and this is Guido Amagakuri's Sweetness and Lightning. And it's interesting. We didn't plan it this way, but I've looked at both of these titles, Sweetness and Lightning and Scumbag Losers, as two ends of a spectrum, right? So Scumbag Loser, as the title may suggest, is about repulsive, questionable, risque subject matter, where Sweetness and Lightning is at the other end of things. As again, as the title suggests, there's quite a bit of sweetness in Sweetness and Lightning. And this is, I don't want to call it a lighter read because people would think that, it's not as good or it's not as serious. I do think that it is a serious series of texts, but it's just very different from Scumbag Loser.
Yeah, it's very different, both thematically, visually, tonally. I mean, in every single way, it's just completely the polar opposite.
Right. So now this is a much more realistic narrative. Some people like to use the term slice of life, and, if that works for you, then that's fine. I like to use realism. So I think that this is much more realistic, definitely, than Scumbag Loser. But this is also a kind of manga that you and I haven't discussed on the show yet, unless I'm forgetting something, and that is cooking manga.
Yeah, I actually I'm glad we got to talk about this because I had no idea that it was actually a cooking manga until I started reading it. But I am glad that we are talking about this because I have long wanted to talk about a cooking manga on the show.
Now, I was looking this up the other day and couldn't find a satisfactory answer, but is there a name for cooking manga outside of cooking manga?
That's a good question. I have never seen one, like with certain genres like chambara is like the specific subgenre of jitageki, which is, the like historical pieces, and chambara are like feature samurai. But for cooking, I have not seen a term that's is like, this is the term you use to describe like a cooking manga.
Right.
So it might exist, but
yeah, I haven't found it. And, like you, I didn't know that Sweetness and Lightning was cooking manga until I got into the very first volume. And I did some digging around. I did some Google searches on, cooking manga, best of, or lists of cooking manga. And there are a variety of pages throughout that are online right now that you can go to and, using a Google search that gives you a list of popular and not so popular cooking manga. I swear to you, Sweetness and Lightning is nowhere to be found on any of those, which I found interesting.
Well, we say it's a cooking manga, and cooking does feature prominently in the series, and there's even recipes at the end of every chapter. But it's possible that people may not think of it so much as a cooking manga as more of like a slice of life manga, because when I think of cooking manga, I think of like Oshinbo, which is like that's all they do. All chapter is cook. Food Wars is all they do. All is cook. It's cook. Food Wars is essentially like a shonen manga, but instead of like fighting with martial arts, they compete with like Iron Chef. So it's possible that the cooking is comparatively a smaller component of this series, and that's why people may not associate the two. Or maybe like Oshinbo is just so good, and we should run out and get the volume that's all about like cooking pot stickers. Yeah. I don't know.
But, I think that that's a problem, though, with those who may categorize cooking manga, because, without the cooking part of Sweetness and Lightning, you would not have Sweetness and Lightning. It is an essential component. And yes, it is a more realistic or slice of life story, and that there is, and we can talk about this potentially, romance involved, or the possibility for romance in some point. But it all comes down to cooking, right? Without the cooking, you would not have this title.
Yeah, it's for listeners who may be familiar, there's a show on Netflix called Samurai Gourmet, which is this Japanese drama about this salaryman who he retires and he doesn't know what to do with his day, and he kind of falls in love with food, but not so much like just eating, but the kind of role that food and eating can play in connecting us to a certain place or a certain person or a certain memory. And I was really thinking about this when I was reading it, because cooking, you're right, cooking is this kind of this plot mechanism that drives everything. But it uses cooking to demonstrate the kind of importance that food and cooking and eating have in forming these memories and forming these like connective bonds and relationships. I don't know where I was going with that. Yeah, I started talking and I trailed off.
No, I think you've underscored what this series is really about, because it's about cooking and bringing people together, but it's also about relationships and how food and the preparation of food really ties into what goes on in bonding, in personal bonding. Now, the 5th volume of Sweetness and Lightning came out not too long ago, back in late March. And so you and I have read up to volume 5, and the good folks at Kodansha Comics, as they have been over the past year, very kind in sending us these books. Volume 6 comes out in about a week from now, June 6th. And so this has been around since July of last year in translation, but this in original Japanese began in March of 2013, and it's still currently ongoing, and it's published in the magazine Good Afternoon. So it's been around for a while. There's an anime series that I haven't seen, a version of this. And the premise of the story, it's fairly simple. It's not as convoluted and as strange as, let's say, Scumbag Loser. But basically what you have in Sweetness and Lightning is a father and daughter, right? You have Kohei Inuzuka and his daughter Tsumugi. And Kohei has just relatively recently lost his wife. We don't know exactly too much detail about why she died. I just assumed it was for health reasons. So he's recently widowed. He's trying to take care of his young daughter Tsugumi. The problem with his attempts to take care of her is he's not a good cook. And not only does he not have the time to cook like he should, but he just doesn't know anything about it. And so he's afraid of cooking. And so he relies on bought dinners or bought lunches, taking his daughter Tsugumi out to dinner. And he doesn't feel satisfied. In other words, he doesn't feel like he's doing what he should be doing as a father to take care of his daughter. One of his students, or a student who goes to the same school that Kohei teaches in, is Kotori Ida. And Kotori, she has a mother that I guess she's somewhat close to, but not really close enough to. And that becomes, I think, a growing storyline as the series continues. And the mother is a celebrity chef, a celebrity cook. And so Kotori has some cooking ability. And in fact, she's grown up in a home that is a restaurant, her mother's restaurant. And so her mother's a famous cook. And so she has learned, working whenever she can with her mother, how to cook. And so Kotori at one point tells Kohei, I'll help you cook for your daughter and I'll help teach you how to cook. And so in this case, the student becomes the teacher. And so that's basically the premise that drives everything that we've read so far, from volume 1 all the way to the most recent volume 5. And so the story is basically a series of narrative arcs or episodes. So you have Kohei, who wants to cook a particular dish for his daughter, or you have Tsukumi, who wants a particular dish and is telling the father, cook this for me, cook this for me. And by the way, Tsukumi loves meat. She's a big-time meat eater. And Kotori helps the father learn how to cook for the daughter, and then get the daughter involved as well as she becomes older and more comfortable around, kitchen utensils and whatnot. And so it's a series of mini stories based around a particular recipe, and at the end of each chapter is that particular recipe. So if you want to learn to cook, and not just Japanese dishes, right? There's some Western dishes in here as well, like pasta alla carbonara, and also Salisbury steak. But you get these recipes. So if you want to learn to cook, then read Sweetness and Lightning.
Yeah, that's I've always liked cooking a manga because that is something that you see a lot in cooking manga. I don't know if I don't want to say it's in every cooking manga, but in all the ones that I've read, they do feature the recipes, which is always great because the stuff they're making is much better than anything I can cook. So getting those recipes is always cool. Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to ask you about your reaction to Sweetness and Lightning in two ways. One, did you feel that at times this series may lapse into sentimentality in a way that it kind of turns you off a little bit? And then the other question is, what are your thoughts on the relationship between the young high school girl Kotori and the teacher Kohei?
I think your first question is, I think it comes close a number of times, but I don't think that it is ever, overly saccharine or anything like that. There are moments where it approaches that, but I don't think it ever gets, overwhelmingly so, where I had to put the book down, or I really kind of had to roll my eyes at it, anything like that. But it is a book that I would really recommend to people. Don't try and binge read this book. Don't sit down and try and read 5 volumes or 6 volumes or 7 volumes of this book, because it will get repetitive. It will get boring.
Like we did. Yeah.
Well, I tried to space it out, but it's it's a very, very kind of by nature a very episodic series that I think lends itself really well to just reading a chapter or two and then maybe the next day or next couple of days and just picking it up and putting it down and reading it on and off. And I actually bet it reads really well in a kind of weekly magazine. But yeah, I think maybe if I had sat down and read all 5 volumes cover to cover in one sitting, I might have felt really kind of overwhelmed by the sentimentality. But because I tried to space it out and just read it one at a time or 2 at a time or like that, I didn't really feel that it was a really big deal. It was a really big problem. But I can see, like I said, there are a couple scenes where I can see that if if I had just read the first 2 volumes and now I was halfway through the third, I might roll my eyes and be like, oh, this is kind of like I'm kind of over this. But yeah, I thought Yamaguti handled the more emotional elements or melodramatic elements fairly well. This isn't a series that I think is like a masterpiece and oh my God, it's the best thing since sliced bread. But I think it's done well and it's handled. Those elements are handled very well.
Right. It's nice.
So your second question, it is. Oh, it's very nice. That is one thing that I wanted to talk about. I think this is like perfect summer reading. Like the last couple of days, we're in Dallas, and the last couple of days, the weather's been really terrible. But the weather today is great. It's sunny. It's not hot. It's not overly humid. It's really comfortable. This is like the perfect thing to read outside right now when the weather is like you got like a gentle breeze and it's not too hot and it's sunny. This is like it's such just a charming and really well drawn comic. I just really was taken with the way Yamaguti draws things, particularly the way he draws eyes, his use of screen tone, the way he draws hairs. There's just like a softness and a gentleness to it and a kind of casualness to the way he draws. It's just a really kind of like charming comic, and it's just enjoyable to sit and read for 20 minutes or 15 minutes or so. And it's just a really good summer read. But to your second question, I would say that I don't like the relationship between Kotori and Kohei. Well, I don't have a problem with their relationship so much as I am kind of skeeved out by the scenes where it is implied that Kotori has like feelings for her teacher and she's like 14. And he's at least in his late 20s, early 30s. But the relationship between like teacher and pupil and also the age difference is just I don't enjoy that at all.
No, she's that young. She's 14.
I thought she was just about to enter high school, was my understanding of it. I thought she was 14 or 15.
I thought she was more like 16 or 17. I guess maybe I may have misread.
I mean, that's possible. I don't think there's anything explicit to tell us how old she is. But just the kind of like from what I understood about where she is in her schooling is I kind of inferred, but that I totally, that could absolutely be wrong. You could be right. But even then, like a 16-year-old, I just don't really have any interest in seeing like a 16-year-old really like pine after a 30-year-old man, especially one who is her teacher. That particular relationship just makes that inappropriate relationship way more inappropriate. So like I said, I don't think there's anything wrong with the relationship per se, because I don't think there's anything inappropriate with how they conduct themselves with one another. Anything that we've seen doesn't strike me as kind of like gross or, anything like that. But there are scenes where Kotori, it's not explicit, but it is kind of implied that she is developing feelings for Kohei. And those moments are moments I don't really have any interest in.
And by the way, this is something that Kohei is not aware of, right? Because those moments that you're describing, and there are a few, they don't happen that frequently, but every now and again.
There's like two or
so. This sentiment bubbles up a little bit, but it bubbles up within the character of Kotori. And I mean, we know her thoughts, and she's thinking something. I mean, she doesn't explicitly come out and say that I'm developing feelings for him, but we can read between her thoughts and her feelings, whatever she's saying or experiencing, to say, okay, there's some affection going on there. And this is something that Kohei is unaware of completely. Now, like you, I do think that this is potentially disturbing. But unlike you, I don't unwelcome it for this reason, because I think it adds a level of drama and relationship complication in ways that would really spice up Sweetness and Lightning. Now, it's a cooking manga, so I didn't mean to use the word spice up in that way, but I guess it is appropriate. But you're right. There is something rather episodic and kind of predictable about each of these narrative arcs. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's a nice story. We get to see the developments of relationships and personal growth slowly. But one of the things that I was wanting as I was reading through these various volumes, especially the last couple, 4 and 5, is I kept feeling there has to be something that's going to happen between these characters or these characters and other characters, like, for instance, Kotori's mom, Megumi, who comes into play at certain moments, but yet she hasn't really played a major role yet, but something needs to happen with character complications to throw things in turmoil, because we definitely don't have what I would call major turmoil in this series by the 5th volume. I mean, there are minor problems that occur and small complications, but those are easily resolvable. So one of the things that I was kind of pulling for is some kind of major drama to occur. What would cause a major drama is if Kotori would, in some way or another, express or acknowledge her feelings for Kohei and what that would mean for their relationship and how they would get beyond that. Now, yes, it may skeeve you out a bit, but it would nonetheless create great drama, right?
Okay, so I will say that you're right. I think that that having Kotori have these thoughts, they're not in a relationship. Like I said, there's nothing between them that is inappropriate. But she is kind of developing these feelings. And I will say that to Agamakuri's point, shall we say, I do think that it is interesting to include that, because I agree with you that it does add a certain texture to the story and to the character, because I think that that's not uncommon for people to have these feelings for people maybe older than them. I'm sure it's very common for teenagers to maybe develop a crush on someone who's older than them, someone who is friendly to them, someone who spends time with. It's only inappropriate if the older party kind of takes advantage of the younger person. But I think the development of those feelings, something akin to like a crush or like puppy love, isn't this kind of like aberrant thing that no one's ever experienced. So it'll be interesting to see how Amagakuri develops her Kotori's feelings for Kohei and how that affects their relationship. Because you're right, if she were to confess to him and he would have to confront them, because obviously he couldn't. I mean, if he did engage in this relationship, I don't know if I could continue reading it. But that confession could introduce a very dramatic dynamic. And it really comes down to how Amagakuri plays those feelings. Right. Because I don't think it would be like this disgusting, horrible thing if she were to say, like I'm attracted to, or I have like feelings for this older person and it's inappropriate and I know I shouldn't, but I do. And for her to confess that, I don't think that's, this offensive thing or anything like that. But it really just is going to depend on how Amagakuri develops that and how he kind of plays that in the long term. Right.
Because in order for narrative to move forward, you need tension, you need the conflict and complications. And so I think that would definitely bring some of that. Another thing that this feeling of Kotori's that is slowly developing, and I think underscoring slowly, right? Because this is nothing that she's acted upon in any way. It's just, as we mentioned, every now and again it bubbles up a little bit. I think what that does is it also helps to establish some of the larger themes that I think are still in the process of being played out in this series, Sweetness and Lightning. And that is when it comes to parent-child relationships, because you have an interesting dynamic going on, an interesting pairing. You have basically a father and daughter, a widow and his daughter, who become friends with another daughter who, for all practical purposes, is fatherless, but who also has a problem with her relationship with her mother. So Kotori's father is still alive. In fact, we see him at one point in one of the stories, and I can't remember which volume of Sweetness and Lightning it's in, but he's no longer a part of Kotori's life because he had an unpleasant break in the divorce with the mother, Megumi. Megumi seems like she could be a good mother, but she's never given the opportunity to be one because she's always working. She's a celebrity cook and she's always in demand on TV, doing guest appearances and whatnot. And so we know that Kotori wants to be closer to her mother and she relishes those moments. And so I think the mother-daughter and then relationship between Kotori and her mother Megumi, and then the father-daughter relationship between Kohei and Tsugumi is a nice, interesting pairing, even kind of a mirroring to some degree. And I think that there's a lot of potential for that to develop into good story material as the series continues.
Yeah, like you said, there's all of these relationships. There's a commonality between them that really drives home, shall we say, some of these themes. And I do think that Yamaguti does a good job of, building those themes and developing them and examining them from different angles, because it's not just the relationship between Kohei and Tsugumi, but you also have these other mother-daughter relationships, these other child-father relationships, and you see another one. I can't remember the child's name in the I think it's the fourth volume. No, maybe it's the fifth volume, where Tsugumi has there's a young boy whose mother is in labor and he doesn't want to go see her in the hospital. And so it is a book that is really about these relationships between parents and children. And like I said, I think Yamaguti does a good job of looking at that theme through a number of different lenses and a number of different relationships. And it, like I said, it just makes for a really kind of charming, fun. You just want to keep reading it. These are characters that you just want to kind of come in and spend a little time with. And
exactly. Yeah. And we also have an albeit slowly growing list of minor characters who become a part of Kohei, Kotori, and Tsugumi's life. So, for instance, there is Kotori's school friend Shinobu, who helps out every now and again. And then there is Kohei's friend when he was in school, Yagi, who now he has a restaurant bar himself, right? And he helps out as well. And so all of these characters get together, and this gets back to this kind of realism, or if you want to call it a slice of lifeness to this story, where you see relationships grow over time, maybe slowly at times, but you get to see, you use the word charming. I use the word nice. And that's what this series is all about. And, in many ways, reading this, it reminded me of Rumiko Takahashi's Maison Ikoku, which, I've wanted us to discuss on this show for a while. But, that's a really long series. But it's something very similar, because you have kind of a realistic setting and you get a variety of different characters in a particular situation or setting. And in the case of Maison Ikoku, it is an apartment building. And it's about how these various characters interact, especially a couple where, at least in the case of Maison Ikoku, you do have a flowering relationship, unlike, you have in Sweetness and Lightning. But it just reminded me of Maison Ikoku, Sweetness and Lightning did.
Yeah, there's something I think that's really, really satisfying about a series like Maison Ikoku that's kind of long running, and there's no real You look at a series like Naruto or like shonen manga where there's a single kind of mega arc that carries you from the first volume to the end. It's this overarching plot that runs through the whole series. That stuff can be interesting, but I think there's something satisfying about a long running series that doesn't have that. That's just this like Sweetness and Lightning. Like it's a kind of plot device where this week they're gonna do this week they're gonna do that, and it's all about cooking and it's all about them making some dish. But there's no real 50 volume plot. But coming back every week or every month or every volume or whatever, and just checking in with those people and seeing how they develop and how those relationships kind of grow and stuff like that can be really satisfying in a really unique and interesting way that I don't think is really. I guess you can do it in like a sitcom, but it's really difficult to pull off in something, I think, other than like a manga. These like short chapters that you can read really briefly and really casually and kind of drop in and drop out of.
Yeah. Yeah, you got a little dog action going on in the background there.
Yeah, she's been going nuts for the last like 40 minutes. It's been driving me crazy.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I just wanted to mention that because our listeners are going to wonder, hey, is there a dog in the background somewhere? No, you're listening to this on this podcast episode. And although we try our best to have a professional sound, sometimes in our settings, that's not entirely possible.
Yeah.
But getting back to Sweetness and Lightning, yeah, I mean, it's a very nice read. It's something that I think I would recommend to all of our listeners. And from the looks of it, Kodansha is coming out with a new volume in English about every 3 months or so.
Yeah. This is definitely a book I'm gonna keep checking out. I was looking to see how many volumes it is, and I stumbled across this little piece of information that I guess the 7th volume was released with a limited edition that included Sugumi's lunchbox. And I hope they almost certainly won't, but I hope Kodansha publishes the US edition with a nice little thing like that.
What do you mean a lunchbox?
I guess it's just I have no idea. I'm trying.
In a lunchbox?
No, it comes with like a lunchbox.
Okay. So yeah, so they combine the book with a lunchbox. So it's
as a nice little kind of like treat for this limited edition.
That would be.
But yeah, it'll be interesting to see if they do any gimmicks like that with the series as they continue to release it.
Well, Shea, we started off this month's episode with Scumbag Loser by Mikoto Yamaguti. And then we turned to a vastly different series, Sweetness and Lightning from Guido Amakakuri. And they came out respectively from Yen Press and Kodansha Comics. And again, I want to thank the publicity people at both Kodansha Comics and Yen Press for providing us with review copies for both of these. So thank you guys. And if you want to find great manga like this, then check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there you will find a lot of comics and a lot of manga. You can't beat their prices there. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do find your manga there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also email us. If you want to email the show, you can email 2guys@comicsalternative.com. If you want to get in touch with me, you can email me at shay@comicsalternative.com. And Derek, where can they email you if they want to get in touch with you?
At Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways for people to get in touch with us, Shea.
Yep. Soon we'll have to add carrier pigeon.
Yes. And so, yeah, we do encourage all of you to get in touch with us. Do what Jason Roulaine does and send us emails and let us know what you think about our show. We'd appreciate that. Until next month, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll be podcasting at you later.